Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case episode 70 of my game system design series. In this video I'll investigate the strength of World War II battalions during the various campaigns, comparing the opposing battalions and how they changed during the war, specifically during the period 1943 to 1945. This is a part 3 of this series. Viewers should ensure they view the previous two videos covering battalion strengths from 1939 and 1942, as well as specifically part 1, which covers how I determined battalion strengths. Starting with 1943, we will start with the campaigns in the desert and Italy. Of course, we'll certainly not ignore the fighting that was occurring in Russia, of which there was a lot of it during 1943. Let's start with leg infantry. There is an amazing level of consistency between the nationalities, even in 1943. Let's look at the motorised, mechanised or armoured infantry that were not in the armoured divisions or brigade. The Germans are similar to the previous year, although there is a slight increase in support formation strength. When we look at the Italians and US, they are unchanged from the previous year. While the British are generally unchanged, there was a minor increase in combat strength. The Russian brigade is taken from the tank corps and is a much more powerful formation than that of the previous year. Now we'll look at motorised infantry in the armoured formations. The Germans had two motorised regiment types. One had an armoured battalion, while the other did not. For the Russian, we're showing the mechanised brigade in the mechanised corps, which contains a tank regiment. This was a powerful combined arms formation. Should be noticed, for the Russians, in my previous analysis of motorised brigades, I used the motorised brigade in the tank corps, which didn't contain a tank regiment. For this analysis, I'm using the mechanised or motorised brigade with a tank regiment. It's a little bit doesn't quite align, but it's the closest that I can align. The Russians were always different. When we look at the British or Italians, there were no changes compared with the previous year. The US deployed light armoured divisions in increasing number. This shows 3 armoured infantry battalions organised into a regimental-sized formation. The structure of the US combat command varied, and I suspect most consisted of 1 armoured infantry battalion and 2 tank battalions at its maximum size, or just 2 battalions, 1 armoured, 1 motorised, at its minimum size. Now let's take a look at the tank regiments. The German battalions grew in strength, primarily due to improved tanks. The Russian tank brigades were also growing in strength, once again due to an increased number of improved vehicles. On the other hand, the British tank brigades dropped in strength. I'm really uncertain why this occurred. The Italians fielded tank destroyers in their tank battalions, and the result was a very powerful formation, particularly in defence. When we look at the US, in the light divisions, the battalions contained a lot of the former heavy regimental support formations, so the battalions were more powerful. They were also assisted by fielding better tanks. This shows a theoretical tank regiment of 3 battalions, which is unlikely to have ever been fielded in reality. This is a summary of the values by nationalities. Compared with 39 to 42, the ranges of values have increased dramatically. Italians are much the same, and with some minor changes, so are the Russians, although they started going up in 43. The British infantry divisions are also much the same, but there is a major change in the armoured division. Motor rifle battalions and tank brigade is new and very powerful. On the other hand, the tank battalions did drop in strength before slowly increasing, then suddenly dropping again in 43 for some weird reason. The Germans have changed most with the infantry. While the leg infantry is the same, the motorised infantry have all been beefed up, and the panzer battalions have grown in strength. The combat strength ranges by battalion types have widened yet again. Let's now move into 1944, which saw Germany fighting almost everywhere. Let's look at the leg infantry, of which there's only Germans and Russians left. As the main combatants in Europe are now down to 4, 2 of which did not normally field leg divisions, we only really have the Germans and Russians to cover here. The Russians' battalions have dropped in strength. This was caused by severe manpower issues. The German infantry regiments have also dropped in strength a small amount, also due to manpower, but nonetheless the drop was minor because they beefed the infantry up with additional equipment. When we look at the motorised infantry, not in an armoured division or corps formation, the German motorised infantry regiments have grown in strength. Mainly the regimental support elements have grown in strength. The Russian motorised brigade, remember this is from the tank corps, is much the same in 1943, although manpower issues have impacted this formation as well. When we look at the British, they're pretty much the same as they were in 1943. This is also the case with the US. After all, why tamper with something which worked really well? The motorised regiments in the Panzer Division comes in two flavours, mechanised and motorised. Both have increased in strength, mainly due to regimental support assets growing in strength. The Russian mechanised brigades, in this case from their mechanised corps, which includes a tank formation, have grown significantly in strength. This is a very powerful combined arms formation. We have moved to the motorised formations in armoured divisions. The British motorised brigades from the armoured divisions are pretty much unchanged. The same also applies to the US armoured infantry battalions. The German Panzer Regiment has grown in strength, mainly due to the Panther Battalion. The Russian tank brigades have also grown in strength, mainly due to a high proportion of medium tanks in the brigade, and also the beginning of the introduction of the T-34-85. The British also gets a major boost in 1944, which is caused by better tanks and other improved equipment. On the other hand, the US Tank Battalion is much the same. There was a gradual increase in quality of German tanks, that is, they're moving from the 75 to the 3-inch gun-armed Shermans, but it didn't have a major impact in terms of points, thus you don't see very much of it in the 1944 structure. This is a summary of the values by nationalities. There are 15 strength-type combinations. The general trend is the motorised, mechanised and armoured formations are all getting much stronger. Now we come to the last year of the war. Let's look at 1945, which mainly consisted of warfare in the former Axis countries, that's Germany, Hungary, etc. When we look at the leg infantry, the Russian foot infantry are unchanged. When we swing over to the German infantry and the Volksgrenadier divisions are slightly more powerful, mainly due to new weapons such as RPGs and ATRLs. However, there was a severe manpower issue in the German army in 1945. The German motorised infantry, not in an armoured formation, theoretically did not change in 1945. The Russian motorised infantry brigade in their tank corps also did not change in 1945. Neither did the British motorised infantry in their motorised infantry brigades. When we swing over to the US, improved support equipment did have a minor positive effect in the US motorised infantry regiments. After the disaster in France, the Germans reorganised their panzer divisions, which made them weaker. This impacted both types of infantry regiments in the panzer division, motorised and mechanised. The Russian mechanised brigade in their mechanised corps were unchanged. The British infantry brigade in the armoured division were also unchanged. The US armoured battalions also remained unchanged in 1945. When the Germans formed their new Panzer division structure in September 1944, the number of tanks in the battalions dropped, which did affect the combat strength of the battalions. This, in theory, carried over into 1945, although, as you can imagine, few divisions were full strength. The Russian tank battalions remained unchanged, although they were receiving much increased numbers of T-34-85s. This was not sufficient to alter its combat strength, at this scale at least. The British Armoured Brigade increased in combat strength significantly. This was due to the arrival of the new British tanks, which were highly effective. This change occurred just before the end of the war. The increased number of 3-inch armed M4 medium tanks had an impact on the combat effectiveness of the US tank battalions, as you can see here. This shows a summary of the values by nationalities in 1945. The Germans are getting a lot weaker, the Western Allies a lot stronger, and Russia remains generally unchanged. Let's now look at how the strength changed over the entire course of the war. This shows the foot infantry battalion strength for the major nations over the 3 time periods. The Germans and Italians remain consistent or constant, and the Germans only have a blip in 1941 downward when they raised emergency divisions. When we move over to 43 to 45, the Germans grew in strength while the Russians remained much stable. When we look at the motorised infantry, not in armoured formations, the Germans increased their strength between 39 and 42. The Italians went backwards and the Russians had a blip in 41. The British remained consistent. Between 1943 and 1945, the Russians grew in 1943, but again dropped back in 44-45. The British remained stable, while the Germans and US grew in 1945. This shows the motorised infantry in armoured formations. The Germans and British display a significant increase over the 3 periods. The Russians decline while the Italians remain constant. Between 1943 and 1945, the Germans suffer a decline while the Russians and British grew in strength. The US remains much the same. Now let's take a look at the armoured battalions. The Germans had a slight increase while the British have a dip in 41. The Russians show a decline and the Italians show an increase in combat strength between the periods 1939 to 1942. When we shift over to the period between 1943 and 1945, the Germans decline in 1945. The Russians remain stable, but the US and UK grew in 1945. What this indicates to me is any game which uses an element scale of battalion needs to take into account both the nationality type and period of a battalion in order to arrive at a historically accurate value. As an example, this shows the progression of the German Panzer Battalion, at least the most powerful in each period, over the course of the war. I need to highlight troop quality, training, doctrine and experience is not factored into this combat strength. Players will need to determine that themselves, and I suspect that's going to be very much a subjective determination. And so we come to an end of episode 70 of my video on game system design, in this case analysing the strengths of World War II battalions and how they changed during the war, specifically in this case between 1943 and 1945. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.